This is the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety's Disaster Discussions podcast, where we explore the intersection of weather and the built environment. Welcome to the Disaster Discussions podcast, where we explore the intersection of weather and the built environment. I'm your host, Rachael Penton Gauthier. Do you know the disaster history of your home, your business, or your neighborhood? Do you know how that risk has changed in the past and what it will look like in the future? Those are just a few of the topics we'll be discussing today to help you get prepared for hurricane season. Our guest today is the lead writer and podcast host for Geotrek and an extreme weather and data scientist with more than 15 years of experience conducting data-driven risk analysis for disaster-prone communities. He develops cutting-edge technologies such as flood information systems that help communities make crucial flood risk and mitigation decisions. He's also an award-winning public speaker on the topic of applied science and has been featured on science specials, including PBS and the BBC. Joining us today is Dr. Hurricane Hal Needham. Hal, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, it's so good to have you on the podcast today. And I want to start off by talking a little bit about you, who you are. I want to find out where you studied. And I also want to know how did you get that nickname, Hurricane Hal? So just tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I grew up in the northeastern states where I just became passionate about weather. Blizzards were my thing. But then I've ended up living in places around the world with extreme weather. Spent several years in North Africa near the Sahara Desert. Spent several years in interior Alaska where I was a winter sports athlete. But the past 17 years I've been along the Gulf Coast where I really got interested in hurricanes, coastal flooding, and tropical weather. In some of these places that get huge impacts, especially during the summer and fall.
Wow. Okay. So you've really made your way around the world. What took you to North Africa and to Alaska? What were you doing there?
I always just wanted to travel the world from the time I was a little kid, and I got an opportunity with a nonprofit when I graduated college. I did a 4-year degree at Penn State University, and I just wanted to travel the world. I got an opportunity to live in Morocco, North Africa, and I said, sign me up. I was in my early to mid-20s, but it was a fascinating area. The geography over there is a lot like California with a coastal plain, big mountains, and desert on the east side, but it was just an amazing experience. And then in my late 20s, early 30s, I had the opportunity to really get into climate science professionally with some opportunities in Alaska. So I went up to Fairbanks, kind of in the middle of Alaska, extremely cold winters there, but an amazing, interesting climate and interesting people as well.
Hey, that's awesome. That's the spirit. That's my motto too. Sign me up. That sounds fun. I actually used to live in Anchorage for the same reason. Just wanted to experience it and get to cover the weather in Anchorage. But Fairbanks is not for the faint of heart. So
yeah, we had a 21-day stretch where the temperature never got above -11. It was always between -11, -51. I was a winter sports athlete, so I biked year round to acclimatize. But remember, 21 days of biking in that between -11 and -51, you definitely get used to it, but it's certainly extreme weather.
Definitely. So, and speaking of weather, how did you first get interested in weather?
My grandmother and my mom were both really interested in the environment and going out to lakes. My grandmother lived near a massive farm field, and she had a little chalkboard, and we would always predict the date we'd see the first robin in the spring or the date of the first snow in the fall. And so we always were really thinking in terms of the environment, of the seasons of weather. And then I just was like glued to it from the time I was about 5 years old, especially with snow in the wintertime, but also, year round, any kind of extreme weather, I was really interested in it.
So I know you've done a lot of research in the weather realm. Tell me about some of the highlights. It sounds like you've done a lot over the years, but what are some of your favorite things you've been able to study?
Oh, yeah. So when I moved to the Gulf Coast, I had the opportunity to do a master's and doctorate degree at Louisiana State University. And I became really interested in tropical weather. And what just amazed me is that storm surges, the saltwater floods in hurricanes, they're the world's most deadly destructive hazard. And when I started grad school in 2008, there was no database to tell you how often these events happen, where they happen, how high they can be. And so I couldn't believe that. This is the world's most deadly destructive hazard and there's no database for it. So starting in 2008, I started really studying storm surge. I built the first coastal flood database for the United States, which eventually now became an international database called USurge, where we really drill down into a community's history and build out those coastal flood histories. That became one of my passions. And then really over the past 12 or 13 years, I've been going into hurricanes. So I've now documented coastal flooding and winds in 23 landfalling hurricanes and tropical storms. And that's been interesting to kind of fuse what I did academically with getting on the ground and doing some storm chasing.
Awesome. Okay, so now I understand how you got the nickname Hurricane Hal then.
Yeah, I don't even know how that started. You know, actually, how it started in 2010, I had built this coastal flood database. And so we'd have an active hurricane coming in, and I'd think, man, this looks a lot like the hurricane of 1943, and we know what flooded. So I created, it was just called Hurricane House Storm Surge Blog, and it was just meant to be a one-season blog, and that ended up being, I don't know, a 7 or 8 season blog that I did, and then that really launched a lot of interactions with social media. And the name Hurricane Hal just kind of stuck after there.
Nice. I love it. Besides hurricanes, I know you've mentioned to me you've done some storm chasing, looking for some hail. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
This spring, I drove over 6,000 miles into as many hail cores as I could. I'm doing a lot of forensic meteorology lately where we actually look back at historic weather events to try to piece together what happened. How much hail was there? Where was the wind damage? And for hail determination, we use radar products, but I didn't really know how accurate these products are. So I just went into as many hail cores as I could. I would go out ahead of them. I had a rental chase vehicle that I did not want to damage. So I'd find shelter in a community that was going to get hit by a hailstorm. And then I'd document when the hail started, when it stopped, how big it was, and even the wind direction and drift. Sometimes hail can actually drift off these big hail cores and travel several miles even outside the storm. So all of that I was documenting this spring, driving over 6,000 miles in the process.
Now, is this a particular project? Who are you documenting this for? Can you talk a little bit about that at all?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Why you're driving so much into so many storms?
Yeah, exactly. So it's been an amazing relationship I have with CNC Catastrophe and National Claims. They're my employer. And through CNC, we launched the Geotrek project. So we're telling stories about extreme weather and natural disasters not covered by the mainstream media. Geotrek is fantastic. We do a lot of media communication, science education, but we also get out and do a lot of field work. And so in a partnership that we have with Allied Trust, they're in the insurance industry. They're really doing a lot of investigation now and trying to determine what happened in past weather events. And they're using forensic meteorology. So really in that partnership between CNC, Geotrek, and Allied Trust, I thought, I really need to better understand how these severe storms work. And there's really no replacement for field work, right? We can have models, we can have radar and computer products, but getting out there in the field and seeing what's actually happening, I always feel like that helps me be a better forecaster and a better scientist.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's one thing to study it from afar, but to be up close and personal and see these things in real life really makes all the difference. Yeah. We're going to talk a little bit more about Geotrek, your own podcast here in a little bit. But I want to talk about this 3-step process for disaster risk assessment that you've told me about. We're going to talk about how folks can understand their risk. And I have to know, is this something you came up with? Is this your kind of original 3-step process? And if so, why did you create it?
Yeah, it is, Rachel. It's something I came up with just over the years with my academic work and my work, just working in communities. And it's really what I call the recipe for risk analysis. And I really feel if people stick with this recipe, it's really going to limit the possibility that they're blindsided. I mean, extreme weather events, natural disasters, they have this way of blindsiding even experts, right? And so this recipe kind of drills down into 3 main areas. If you follow these, I think it really minimizes people's chance of being blindsided by an extreme weather event.
Yeah, absolutely. We want people to be prepared, know what is possible. And I want to talk about step number 1. So this is know the deep disaster history of a location. What does that mean?
So, Rachel, a lot of times I work a lot in flood-prone communities along the Gulf Coast, and I can't tell you how many times I've talked to someone who says, "Oh, my neighborhood doesn't flood. I've been here 30 years. We never flood. We don't." I've even told my neighbors they don't need flood insurance, things like that. So what happens from the human perspective, 25, 30, 40 years, this is a long amount of time. But with Mother Nature, that's just a blink of an eye. And what I found when I built these deeper flood data sets, I mean, the flood data I'm building is from the mid 1800s until present. What I find all the time is that there'll be communities or neighborhoods that they have not flooded in 30 or 40 years. But when you go back deeper into history, they've flooded multiple times. And so this is our concern. If you don't go back far enough in the history, you can get blindsided by events that are simply repeating what's happened maybe 100 or 120 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. We hear about these once in a lifetime events, but as we know, a lifetime is only so long, right? We have had previous generations that have experienced some of these same events.
Rachel, a great example of this was last summer in the Tampa St. Pete area. I mean, this area had been what I considered one of the luckiest areas on earth. They've been avoiding hurricane strikes, and part of it's climatology, but a lot of it's been luck. They've had a lot of storms that hit south of them, a lot of storms that hit north of them, and they had been very lucky for 121 years. And so when Hurricane Helene was barreling towards the west coast of Florida last year, the National Hurricane Center slosh model was really pegging we're going to see coastal flooding in Tampa St. Pete. I was on the ground the day before landfall, literally going through communities, warning people, you will probably flood. And what I heard again and again is, hey, I've been here since 1978. We've never flooded before. The day after the storm, these same people are in the streets just shocked and in disbelief that they flooded. In their mind, this is the first time they've ever flooded. Historically, that would actually be the fourth time these houses have flooded because there were major hurricanes, two of them in 1848, one of them in 1921. So what we can say is this has not happened in living memory, but if you go back 180 years, this is the fourth time this community flooded. That's a flood every 45 years. So what seemed to people like a million-year storm, that was such an outlier. Historically, it wasn't really a million-year storm. It was maybe more like a 45-year storm. They had just been very lucky for a long time. Unfortunately, their luck ran out.
And I want to talk about Helene some. What about the Helene aspect? We've heard what happened later described as unprecedented with the flooding and the Appalachians, and of course that was absolutely catastrophic, destroying communities. But what does the risk history of this area of the country tell us about? What was Helene's flooding event completely unprecedented, or was there some type of deep disaster history that we maybe could have honed in on?
Yeah, Rachel, this is a really good question. So, unfortunately, Helene was this multidimensional storm, right? So, we had massive storm surge flooding along the west coast of Florida. And then, unfortunately, the disaster wasn't done. The storm tracked inland and dumped up more than 30 inches of rain in western North Carolina. So, it was really this multiple phase disaster. And a lot of people in western North Carolina, I mean, the devastation was just catastrophic, unfortunately. Whole communities were washed away. But this was interesting that you heard people say there, well, this is completely unprecedented. This is an act of God. This has never happened before, or people saying this has to be climate change. What was really interesting about what happened in North Carolina, and this kind of actually gets into phase two of my recipe of risk analysis. The first one is knowing your deep disaster history. So the second one, though, is really like assessing risk in your neighborhood. And when I say neighborhood or region, I mean looking around your region to see what other disasters have happened. Although there had never been a rain bomb like this with 30 plus inches in western North Carolina, I had just done some podcasting and some interviews from storm survivors of Hurricane Camille in 1969. So we think of Camille as a massive Category 5 hurricane in coastal Mississippi, a big storm surge. But Camille tracked inland and it dumped one of these rain bombs, just like we saw with Helene. But this was in the western part of the state of Virginia in 1969. It dumped over 30 inches of rain there along the eastern front of the Appalachians in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And unfortunately, it was the deadliest disaster in Virginia's history. What's interesting is 2 Januaries ago, so the January before Helene hit, January of 2024, I spoke at a conference in Mobile, Alabama, and I showed a map that was shaded from Georgia to Pennsylvania on the eastern side of the Appalachians. And I said, everyone in this area needs to know what Camille did in western part of Virginia in 1969. It dumped a 30-inch rain bomb. And you have to consider, had that storm tracked a little farther south, this could happen in the Carolinas. Had it tracked a little farther north, it could happen in Maryland or Pennsylvania. But this concept of knowing what's happened in the region, that really gets into phase two. Knowing your deep disaster history can really help you from being blindsided. But also, if you know what's happened in your region, to the right or left of you, to the north or south of you, you can really get an idea then of other potential catastrophes that could happen in your community.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe unprecedented for this specific area, but not unprecedented for the region. Have some notes here. Nelson County observed more than 6,000 landslides, up to 114 people killed in the deadliest disaster in Virginia's history. So that sounds a lot like what happened in North Carolina with Helene.
Exactly. And you know what's interesting is we cannot stop these storms from coming, but there are things we can do to get out ahead of them and prepare for them. And for example, we have that same physical setup, right, in the western part of North Carolina as we do in the western part of Virginia. You can have warm, moist air pulled up from the Gulf and the Atlantic and these hurricanes where they have uplift along the eastern part of the Appalachians. They can create tremendous rainfall events. And again, had people in the western part of North Carolina realized what happened in Virginia, just several hundred miles north of there in Camille, I think they could have maybe more imagined that this was a possibility in their community.
Right. So that's a great example of that catastrophic flooding. Also, this can be applied to extreme wind, Pensacola, Florida. Another example. Tell me about Pensacola. We know they've not experienced a direct hit from a major hurricane recently, but certainly possible based on that risk history.
Well, and that's it. Drilling down into your deep history, whether it's wind, water in your community, it's going to tell you a lot, but it won't tell you everything. So, for example, we categorize hurricanes on a scale of 1 to 5 based on wind. It's called the Saffir-Simpson Hurricane Wind Scale. Stronger the winds, the higher the category number. We've only had 4 hurricanes on record since 1851 that made landfall in the U.S. as Cat 5s. And it's interesting, along the northern Gulf Coast, we have 2 of them. We have Hurricane Camille, 1969 in coastal Mississippi. But then you go farther east from there, kind of in the Big Bend area of Florida, a little bit east of Panama City, we had Hurricane Michael in 2018. This was also a Category 5. But imagine if you're in, say, Pensacola, Florida, or you're in Mobile, Alabama. You say, well, I've looked back through our entire history. We've never had a Cat 5 landfall. It's never happened. So I don't need to worry about that. But when you look to your east, you see Michael was a Cat 5. You look to your west, you see Camille was a Cat 5. You know you get very warm water there in the northern Gulf in the summer. You could imagine that the chance of a Cat 5 happening is a low probability, but it's not impossible. It's happened to your east. It's happened to your west. At some point, that will happen along the coast there. Alabama, Western Florida Panhandle. Could be this year. It could be 300 years from now. But we know that it's happened in the neighborhood. And so we have to realize that it could happen. And eventually one day it will.
Yeah, absolutely. What comes to mind for me is Hurricane Frederick. I am actually am from Mobile, born and raised in Mobile. My dad, Mark, has lived in Mobile for many decades, and he tells stories of riding out Hurricane Frederick in Mobile. That was all the way back in 1979. Now, really, Mobile has not experienced a wind event like Frederick. Since that occurred in 1979, we've had George, which flooded downtown Mobile. We felt some effects from Katrina, Ivan as well. But Mobile County itself has not had a direct hit from a major hurricane since the late 70s. My dad still lives in Mobile, so that's certainly something he thinks of. But I know the city has experienced tons of new people moving to it since the 70s. So I would imagine there are quite a few people not aware of that deep disaster history of Mobile, and that they are long overdue for a major hurricane.
Yeah, Rachel, you're spot on about that. I'm actually very familiar with Mobile's history. CNC Catastrophe and National Claims, the company I work for, they're based in Mobile. So I spent a lot of time over there. And you're exactly right. There have been strong hurricanes to the west, strong hurricanes to the east. You really have to go back to the late 70s and Hurricane Frederick to see a major hurricane hit there. But boy, they've been close, right? Ivan in 2004 just missed to the east. Even just several years ago, Category 2 Hurricane Sally, a slow-moving hurricane, hit Baldwin County, Alabama, just to the east of Mobile County. But, you look along the coast and you see areas like Mobile and over in Destin, Florida. You see these places and people will start to say, why do hurricanes never hit there? Why do they always miss? And I think there's a lot of randomness, right? If you pick up a die and start rolling it, you'll be like, why do I never roll a 4? Well, if you roll enough, eventually you will. And I think we see areas of the coast that have been unlucky, like South Louisiana. They've been getting hit by hurricane after hurricane over the past decade. Then we go over to places like Mobile. They've been very lucky. But you have to look in the region and realize, wow, there are a lot of big storms hitting near us. Eventually, it's going to come knocking on our door.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we move on to the third step, though, I want to ask: so how can the average person, how can they educate themselves about that deep disaster history of the location and about the risks in their neighborhood? How can people educate themselves and really prepare for these things?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it really depends on the hazard. With weather work, you get specialized groups. The Storm Prediction Center out of Norman, Oklahoma, funded by NOAA, they have amazing climatologies where they break down severe weather into tornado, wind, and hail, and you can actually see week by week climatologies. And when I say climatology, I mean long-term weather patterns. Like if you want to see what areas are most likely to be hit by a tornado in May or a big hail in June. You can see maps of all of that. Again, that's the Storm Prediction Center out of NOAA. We also have HURDAT. That's the official hurricane database. That's HURDAT. That's the official hurricane landfall database we have for the United States. It goes back to 1851. So if you're interested in tropical weather, if you want to see your region and what the history is, you can just do a web search for the HURDAT database. And then I run the USurge database. This is coastal flood data going back to the mid 1800s. You can do a search for U-surge or just reach out to me. And I work with communities to really understand that history. And again, it's understanding the history for your community. I want to briefly talk about this because it's important. When you think about your neighborhood or your region where you need to consider, it's not just as if you're drawing a circle around your community and saying, what's happened within 100 miles of me? I live in Galveston, Texas. My elevation is 9 feet. I'm on a barrier island, very prone to hurricanes. When I think about looking around my region, I'm not just drawing a circle and saying what's happened within 100 miles of me. Houston Metro is 60 miles from me. They have a very different weather history and very different threats. They're more threatened by severe weather. They're more threatened by winter weather. But when you get to storm surge, the coastal flooding and hurricanes, or even hurricane winds, their risk is a lot lower than where I live right on the coast. I'm 10 blocks from the beach. And so I really need to look at a strip of the coast, really, say from Texas through Mississippi. And I need to look along the coastal area. I'm more interested in what's happened in coastal Louisiana and Mississippi for assessing my risk than I am at looking 100 miles inland, where they don't really have those coastal hazards. So when you think about looking around that neighborhood, think about what are areas in my region that have a similar physical geography and similar threats.
Yeah, and of course, lots of great data available. I also just kind of think, sort of asking around, asking your neighbors if you're new to an area, talk to someone who's maybe lived in the area for a while and ask them what to do, what you've seen, what is possible. I know when I moved into a new neighborhood in Louisiana, the first thing I did was go next door and ask my neighbor, when is the last time the neighborhood flooded? Because we had an ornamental pond in the neighborhood, and in Louisiana, we received a lot of rainfall. I knew it was possible that it was flooding, and he told me it had flooded about 6 or 7 years prior. And I said, okay, great. I know it can flood
Yeah.
and prepared for that. And, I know it'll happen again.
Well, that's right, Rachel. Talking to neighbors, another good source, go to your local library. If you're new to a community, go to a historical association or a library. They'll have history on the community and extreme weather events, natural disasters. That'll be right there in your community's history. You can also always go to the National Weather Service. They have regional offices, and most of those regional offices have web pages that'll actually have a list of all the major weather events that have happened historically, maybe the 15 or 20 biggest events. Read through those. Again, you just want to educate yourself on what's happened in the past and realize, we can repeat those things today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's another great resource. Those pages are usually pretty easy to navigate to on the local National Weather Service office pages. So certainly some great tips there. Now, step number 3, this is consider environmental change. So in addition to knowing that deep history and the risks in the neighborhood, we need to know about environmental change and those shifting conditions that we are all very aware of in the present
For
day.
sure. Yeah. And this gets into, you can know the history for your community. You can know what's happened in the neighborhood. That doesn't tell you everything because we do have environmental change. And when I talk about environmental change, I'm really thinking about 2 things. The first one is changes to our human development and the built environment. For example, we see explosive population growth, especially in the southern and western states, where you look at a satellite picture from 20 years ago and you just have open farmland or grassland or desert. And today you have suburban sprawl in these areas. Well, we know suburban sprawl, we put down a lot of concrete, put down a lot of roads and a lot of big parking lots. Those are what we call impervious surfaces, meaning when it rains like crazy on a Home Depot or Walmart parking lot, that rain isn't draining into the soil anymore. It's running off. And so imagine if you live in a community that's next to a river or a creek, but upstream, there's been tremendous population growth. A rainstorm that hits your community today, you're not going to see the same flood patterns that you would have seen maybe 20, 30 years ago. You're going to see a lot more runoff, a lot higher rises in creeks and rivers. So again, it's not enough just to look at what's happened historically. We have to consider what we call those land use changes, for one. That's the first piece of it. The second piece of it is looking at climate change. Climate is changing. And we're seeing some changes, for example, with storms, with more moisture, heavier rain. I work a lot with tropical weather, and we really have reasons to believe the Gulf of Mexico and some of these ocean areas the temperatures are running much warmer than they used to be. That can produce rapidly intensifying hurricanes, more rainfall in hurricanes, and we also have sea level rise along the coast. So these are changes that are really shifting the baseline. What we talked about, knowing your history, knowing the neighborhood, that's really building a baseline, but these baselines are shifting, and we have to consider that as well.
Fortified Fred here. At IBHS, we've spent more than a decade studying the damage caused by hurricanes, tornadoes, high winds, and hail. We identified the common weaknesses in homes built using conventional construction standards and spent years researching the best solutions by putting them to the test at our research center. Now, you can use our science to defend your home or business simply by asking your builder or contractor to follow the Fortified Construction Standard to protect your home when severe weather strikes, keeping the roof on and the rain out. Visit fortifiedhome.org to learn more.
Absolutely. A great example of that comes to mind would be Harvey, which I assume you're quite familiar with in the Houston metro area. That was one of those events that, despite knowing the disaster history of that area, that was one of those events that I'm not sure anyone could have seen coming with that extreme rainfall.
Rachel, that rainfall is almost indescribable. I mean, we had days and days and days of torrential rain along the upper Texas coast, Houston Metro, over to Beaumont, Port Arthur. Many areas in Houston Metro getting 40 to low 50s inches of rain from one storm. I mean, that's the annual rainfall. I did a litigation. I was involved with a forensic meteorology case over in the Beaumont, Port Arthur area. There was a location that got 56 inches of rain in 8 days. And this is amazing. If you can bear with me on the statistics here. If it had taken 2 months to create that much rain, it would have been classified as a 1,000-year storm, meaning a storm so rare that only happens once every 1,000 years. That would have been if it took 2 months to get that much rain, but they got it in 8 days. Statistically, it didn't even plot on our chart. We don't know what it was. Maybe a 10,000-year flood event, a 20,000-year. It was so unusual. We almost had no context to understand how rare this was. That was just an exceptional storm. And then 2 years later, Tropical Storm Imelda, not as well known nationally, it did not really impact Metro Houston, but again, over by Beaumont, Port Arthur, there was an area that got 25 inches of rain in 12 hours. That was also classified as a 1,000-year rainfall event for 12 hours. So you had two events that were over 1,000-year events in 2017 and 2019. So just in 3 years, you're getting these multiple 1,000-year flood events. Again, this could be bad luck. This could be randomness, but we think there is a climate change element to this. We do believe the Gulf waters are much warmer than there used to be. There's a lot of moisture out there to fuel these storms, but also the models and the observations show that tropical cyclones, hurricanes and tropical storms tend to be moving slower at landfall. And so the models have predicted that was going to happen. And we're seeing a lot of these storms move very slowly or even stall out as they're making landfall. So they can just dump a lot more rain along the coastline and inland.
Right. And of course, after we see these extreme events, immediately everyone wants to speculate, was this so devastating due to climate change? There's a lot of talk about that. And it's not so easy to just put a label on it and say, yes, this was extreme because of climate change, because extreme events have always existed. Some are becoming more extreme. But how do we differentiate between what could be or could not be tied to climate change when it comes to some of these events?
Rachel, I'm so glad you asked this because, now every time we see a flood or a drought, it's just called, well, it happened because of climate change. Well, that becomes difficult historically because we look back thousands of years ago, we can see in the geologic record, we can see in the human record, floods, droughts, freezes, heat waves, they're all part of human history. And so when we see an event today, how do we know what part of that is climate change and how do we know what part of that is just a flood or just a drought? Climate Central is doing fantastic work on this very topic on something they call climate change attribution. So they'll, for example, take a flood event and they'll try to statistically calculate what percentage of this was influenced by climate change and what percentage of this is just natural variability. And so they'll try to tease out the attribution of what part of this was climate change and what part of it wasn't. Again, that's called climate change attribution. But I think it's an important perspective to realize that, you get people on two camps. Some people you get saying, oh, climate change isn't real, it's not really happening. And then on the other extreme, you can get people saying every flood and every drought is climate change. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. What we're doing is really shifting baselines, but we have to start by knowing our history, knowing what's happened in the region. But again, these baselines are shifting with climate change. You can check out this great work that Climate Central is doing on that topic.
Another example that comes to mind, we have to consider how the built environment influences these events as well, right? So the Los Angeles wildfires occurred in California, in all of California's history, but we saw those devastating fires happen in LA County, the most populated county in Southern California, or one of them. We have so many people living in these areas that have a high wildfire risk. So you have to think, a century ago, there weren't that many people living there. Maybe today, obviously, densely packed communities, homes built close together. So when you have one of these natural events that has always happened, but it occurs in one of these areas where the built environment is just full of people and full of houses, that obviously, increases the scale of the actual disaster that comes along with the natural hazard.
Rachel, I'm really glad you brought that up. We're seeing explosive population growth, especially in the southern and western states. So when we think west, we think seismic events, wildfires, atmospheric rivers in the wintertime with massive floods. We've seen tremendous droughts. So the west has a lot of hazards. And then the south, obviously, we have our severe weather in the southern plains over through the southeastern states, a lot of floods, a lot of hurricanes, a lot of severe weather. So these are areas of the country that tend to have extreme weather, but we're seeing tremendous population growth, tremendous sprawl. So a lot of the landscape now looks very different than it did decades ago. So just like you said, the same storm that would have hit 30 years ago is going to have a lot more impact today in a lot of these areas.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk here at IBHS a lot about severe convective storms, and in particular, some of those big metroplex areas like the Dallas metroplex, a hotspot for hail. And we've heard all the stories about, the increased population growth of the state of Texas, people flocking to Texas, places like Austin and Dallas. But these are areas that have a high risk for hail. So now we have many more homes in the path, possibly in the path of these hailstones that can lead to even more destruction.
Rachel, it's interesting when you talk to people, you'll often hear them say, well, disasters can happen anywhere, right? And they'll list earthquakes in California and hurricanes in Florida. But the fact is that the risk of disasters, it's very much based on geography. And we have some areas of the country that really have lower risk in general. You go to Wisconsin and Michigan, you're going to get severe cold outbreaks and snow and some severe weather. But in general, when you look at the risk for high wind events or large hail or large floods, the risk in the Great Lakes region is substantially lower than the Southeast, for example. So we really do need to realize that disaster risk and extreme weather risk, it's very much based on geography. And some of these areas, southern states over through the western states, have higher geography of risk, but that's really where we're growing the population. So we are seeing a lot of these multiple billion-dollar disasters, a lot more than we used to.
Yeah, and one last example I want to hit on is just that changing tornado alley. And this is something that I've had the opportunity to kind of witness just in my own lifetime, growing up in Mobile. And I've worked as a meteorologist across Louisiana and parts of the South. And even back when I was in college, Oklahoma City was the place to go if you wanted to be a TV meteorologist covering tornadoes. But I found myself in Louisiana with more tornadoes than I ever imagined that I would cover, as we've seen kind of this secondary tornado alley shift to what we call the Deep South, or Dixie Alley, from East Texas all the way over through Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. Absolute hotspot for tornado activity. And it's really been interesting to cover these storms and then go out in the field and talk to folks and say, I've heard from so many, older people telling me, when I was a kid, we did not have this many tornadoes. What is happening? And we've really seen that shift for tornado activity into the Southeast.
You know what's interesting, Rachel, when you go to the SPC, the Storm Prediction Center out of Norman, when you look at their annual tornado climatology and you look where do the most tornadoes happen, actually, it's a bullseye around Mississippi, Alabama. And it shocks people because they're like, wait, the movie Twister was filmed in Oklahoma and Dorothy and Toto were running from a tornado in Kansas. Isn't it the Southern Plains? What's interesting is the Southern Plains has this very peaked tornado climatology. You'll never see probably more tornadoes in the world than the Southern Plains in May. But what's interesting about Dixie Alley, you get this low level of tornado risk all through the fall, winter, and spring. So tornado, the Southern Plains, you really have this peak in April and May, but then it dies off. When we get to Dixie Alley, they keep a low level of tornado risk really through the fall, winter, and spring that does not exist in places like Oklahoma. So cumulatively, they actually get more tornadoes annually in Alabama and Mississippi. A lot of people are surprised by this for different reasons. A lot of these tornadoes tend to be nocturnal, happening at night. A lot of them are rain wrapped, so we don't see them from a distance. We don't get that great photogenic picture. And also, if you spent time in Mississippi and Alabama, you've seen the tremendous forest there, really high trees. So you could be a storm chaser in Mississippi. There's a tornado 2 miles away and you can't see it. Compared to on the open plains, you get more visibility. So for different reasons, really the risk in Alabama and Mississippi, it's not as well known, but they actually have the most annual tornado risk of anywhere in the country.
Yeah, my first holiday in the TV meteorology business, I covered a tornado outbreak on Christmas Day in Louisiana. That's the one that produced that big tornado in Mobile as well. So yeah, certainly a big risk across the Southeast during those winter months. So just kind of want to sum everything up here. This is a lot of what IBHS is working to do. We're developing these mitigation actions based on our science. We want people to be able to take these actionable steps to reduce their risk of loss. So just kind of sum up these 3 steps and anything else people should know about your 3-step for disaster risk.
Yeah, like predicting the future is uncertain, right? Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. But the idea, I think, is to try to educate and arm ourselves so much that the chance of being blindsided is really minimized, right? So if you know your deep disaster history going back to the late 1800s where you live, and you know what's happened in the region, you look to the east and west and north and south and get an idea of what's happened regionally, and then you're considering environmental changes to land use and the built environment and local climate changes as well. If you're well versed on this stuff, I think the chance of being blindsided is really reduced. It's never zero. We live in an uncertain world and strange things happen all the time. But I think knowing these things and then doing what IBHS does so well is arming people like, okay, so even if you know your risk, what can you do to then mitigate that risk? How can you build better for wildfire? How can you build better for strong winds or flooding or hurricanes? And I think it's that combination of knowing the 3-step process, but then saying, okay, how do we take action on that? And again, checking out what IBHS is doing to build better for storms. You can actually take this information and put it into action to reduce the risk of loss for yourself and your community.
Yeah, absolutely. We have about 50,000 fortified homes between Mobile and Baldwin County down in coastal Alabama. We saw fortified proven success after Hurricane Sally. We've seen less than 1% of the homes in that path that with fortified roofs had to file a claim that was not related to tree damage. So we know that the components of fortified roof work. To some extent, there's not much you can do about trees if you have trees around your home, but we've seen the science at work, and we've already seen this success with Hurricane Sally. So when Mobile County's time rolls around again, we'll see fortified put to the test there as well.
Hey there, Dr. Ann Cope, Chief Engineer for IBHS. What is the best roof? That's a question we get asked a lot here at IBHS, and the answer is complicated because it depends a lot on where you live. Roofs should stand up to everyday thunderstorms and limit the damage from oncoming hurricanes. With our Roofing Roadmap strategic initiative, we're making the IBHS science about weather and roof performance available for you. Visit ibhs.org/roofing roadmaps and take our Roof 101 course right now to learn about asphalt shingles, America's most popular roof cover. How well does your shingle roof stand up to wind and hail? What do you need to know about roofs? Get the science at your fingertips today. ibhs.org.
So as we wrap this up, I want to talk a little bit more about your podcast, the Geotrek podcast. Tell me about some of your favorite episodes and your favorite moments from this. You guys, I think you have 100 plus episodes. I checked out some of them. Have any favorite moments or people that you've interviewed?
You know, my favorite thing, Rachel, with the Geotrek podcast, we're telling stories about extreme weather and natural disasters not covered by the mainstream media. My favorite moments on the podcast are actually the ones where I'm out there on the ground in a wildfire zone or a hurricane zone or some disaster. And I consider it marinating. I'm just staying in the disaster zone for days, just talking to anyone that'll talk to me. It could be professionals. It could be local residents that survived the storm. What did they learn? How, what are lessons learned that we can share with others? Those are really my favorite moments on the podcast. And sometimes it gets pretty intense. I'll be in a disaster zone and there'll be helicopters flying overhead doing rescue missions and sirens in the background. But there's nothing quite like being there in the disaster zone. And, I guess professionally you'd say I'm an expert, but I don't think of myself in that way. I think of myself as a learner. And I think everyone around me is the experts, even the local residents. I don't care what their education background is. They've just survived a horrific storm. What can we learn from their experience? And those are my favorite moments, I think, getting out in these disasters and just soaking it up and just learning everything I can from the people on the ground.
And how can people check out your podcast?
They can find it anywhere they listen to podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anywhere you listen to podcasts. Do a search for Geotrek. That's Geotrek. Again, we're covering these stories behind the extreme weather and disasters, covering all hazards from hurricanes and tornadoes and severe weather over to wildfire. And actually, this year we did a couple episodes with IBHS. We did one on the wildfires in California. And also IBHS is doing really cutting edge work on testing roofs and building better roofs for hail damage. And we did a hail podcast with IBHS as well. So check those out as well. They've aired over the last several months.
Awesome. Definitely check that out. And this particular podcast episode will be airing as we head into hurricane season. So what are your plans for the season ahead? And, what are your thoughts on the upcoming hurricane season?
Yeah, we're expecting an active season. The Atlantic continues to run warm. It's been running warm since 1995, and that's pretty normal. We have what's called the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. So the Atlantic basin tends to stay warm or cool for multiple decades at a time. A lot of people say every year's forecast to be above average. We're kind of in an above average time right now. So we're the combination of the warm Atlantic and what we call ENSO neutral conditions in the Pacific. We're not really in an El Nino or a La Nina. I think overall we're expecting slightly above normal activity this season. But again, we always have to be prepared. It only takes one hit in your community to make it a terrible season. I'm based in Galveston, Texas. My team with CNC is over in Mobile, and we'll be covering the entire tropical season, everywhere from forecasting mid to long range to actually once there are named storms, we'll be forecasting their impacts. A lot of what I do is forecasting the impacts for wind, water, and rainfall and storm surge as well. And then we'll be on the ground as well, documenting what happens and doing podcasts and educational content to learn what we can in the disaster zones.
Awesome. Hal, well, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been great having you on the podcast, and it was great to learn about your adventures all around the world and talk about this disaster risk, three-step disaster risk.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and congratulations to you and IBHS. I love the educational content. Y'all are doing so much good educational content, doing podcasts and videos, but then you're putting all this stuff into action by actually giving people specific steps they can take to make their homes better prepared. So congratulations to you and your team, and I look forward to listening to more episodes of the IBHS podcast as well, Disaster Discussions.
This has been Disaster Discussions, assessing your disaster risk with Geotrek's Hurricane Hal. Thanks for listening to the Disaster Discussions podcast. Join us next month for a new episode. For more on IBHS's ongoing research efforts, visit ibhs.org.